Welcome to Music History Monday for July 8th, 2024. I'm Bob Greenberg, and the title for today's podcast is What's in a Name? If you haven't already, please consider joining me on my subscription site at patreon.com/RobertGreenbergMusic, where I blog, vlog, podcast, pontificate, review, and bloviate 4 to 6 times a week. We mark the birth on July 8, 1935, 89 years ago today, of the American Grammy and Emmy award-winning singer, actor, and comedian Steve Lawrence in Brooklyn, New York. He died just 4 months ago on March 7, 2024, in Los Angeles. Steve Lawrence, one might ask? Have potential topics for Music History Monday become so depleted that after nearly 8 years, my first such blog was posted on September 9th, 2016, that after 8 years I've been reduced to profiling baritone-voiced male pop singers of the second half of the 20th century? Why, who's next? Dean Martin, Perry Como, Andy Williams, Tom Jones, Jack Jones, Vic Damone, Al Martino, Robert Goulet? And what of it? I would rather aggressively ask in response. Over the years, I've profiled the likes of Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, Elvis Presley, Tony Bennett, Otis Redding, and Chubby Checker, among others. So why not Steve Lawrence? Okay, I will admit that there is an ulterior motive here, and we'll get to that ulterior motive behind this profile of Maestro Lawrence in due time. But first, permit me, please, to reminisce. Fitting in. As I have mentioned more than once, I was born and spent my first years in that Olduvai Gorge of American ethnicity, pronounced etnicity, that would be the New York City borough of Brooklyn. 3 of my 4 grandparents were born there as well. The 4th, my paternal grandfather, was born in Elizabeth, New Jersey, but moved to Brooklyn as a toddler and grew up there. Both of my parents and my stepmother were born in Brooklyn and grew up in Brooklyn. That's a lot of freaking Brooklyn. While I grew up in the New Jersey burbs and was shaped by the lower middle-class suburban experience of the 1950s and 1960s, my grandparents and my parents were all New Yorkers to the bone and were shaped by the dual experience of growing up in Brooklyn and by being the children and grandchildren of Jewish immigrants from Belarus. That meant maintaining something of their ethnic and religious identity while, paradoxically, at the same time, trying to blend in, to assimilate, to be, as my paternal grandfather, Sidney, would say, real Yankees. When my extended family got together, you could count on certain conversations to always take place. The alte Kaker, meaning the old men, literally old poopers, would play pinochle and complain about politicians, taxes, the stock market, the weather, and the New York Mets. Boring and predictable. It was the women of my mother's and grandmother's generations whose conversations I would eavesdrop on because they were interesting and they were funny. If they saw me listening, they'd start speaking in Yiddish, so I'd have to keep my distance and look as if I wasn't listening to them at all. I recall their conversations as representing gossip and innuendo raised to high art, conversations more often than not fixated on other women. Who was married to the worst/best husband? Sometimes the same thing. He slaps her around, but he makes a good buck. who had the best, worst clothes and jewelry, and what they paid for their best, worst clothing and jewelry, who was too fat or too thin. Yes, these were Jewish ladies, so it was indeed possible to be too thin. Who wore too much makeup and who wore too little, whose teeth needed fixing and hair needed cutting and or coloring, who was drinking too much and popping diet pills, meaning methamphetamines, which were legal at the time, who was sexless and who was stuffing the mailman, etc. The comments I enjoyed the most were about the people I actually knew, my girl cousins, some of whom were these ladies' daughters. This one needs to go on a diet. That one needs a nose job. This one needs to see a dermatologist. That one has to dress more appropriately. This one needs to do something with her hair. That one needs braces. Genuine compliments for anyone were few and far between, though the greatest compliment that these women could bestow on any fellow female is burned into my memory. Quote, "She could pass," unquote. She could pass, meaning she could pass for a goy, for not being Jewish. The beneficiary of such a compliment would be slim, but not, God forbid, skinny. Her hair and teeth would be straight. Her skin would be clear, her accent undetectable, and her nose a button. I think it's safe to say that for these two generations of New York City-born Jewish women, my grandmothers were born in 1893 and 1899, my mother and stepmother in 1926 and 1928, respectively. For these generations of New York-born Jewish women, looking too Jewish, especially for girls, was considered a serious liability. Being an upwardly mobile American, a Yankee, was about fitting in, about looking and sounding the non-Jewish part, and not incidentally, about having a name that didn't scream Yiddishkeit, meaning the Jewish way of life. Of all the issues just mentioned, the easiest one to deal with for both men and women, boys and girls, was your name. Granted, a Jewish-sounding name was fine as long as you were living in the extended shtetls that were the Brooklyn neighborhoods of Flatbush and Midwood and Bensonhurst. But if you were born in Brooklyn with a name like Sidney Leibowitz between, say, 1900 and 1945, the temptation to change that name for professional reasons once you were a young adult looking for work was overwhelming, especially for young people going into professions and or working in the American public eye. Sidney Leibowitz, which finally brings us back to Steve Lawrence. He was indeed born Sidney Leibowitz in Brooklyn on July 8, 1935. He came by his musical bona fides honestly. His father, Max Leibowitz, was a cantor, meaning a professional singer and prayer leader at Temple Beth Shalom in Brooklyn. His mother, Anna, born Gelb, was a homemaker. For a Jewish-born entertainer of Sidney Leibowitz's generation, a name change was not optional. It was a necessity, a matter of professional survival. He was 15 years old when he won an Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts competition and sang for a week on Godfrey's morning radio show that young Mr. Leibowitz began calling himself Steve Lawrence. The source of that name? The first names of his two nephews, Steve and Lawrence. Steve Lawrence was best known as one half of the singer-slash-entertainer duo of Steve and Edie. Edie being his wife, Edie Gourmet, 1928 to 2013. The two met in 1953 when they were both employed as singers on The Steve Allen Show, a late-night television show on NBC that went national the next year, in 1954, as The Tonight Show. Ms. Gourmet was born in the New York City borough of the Bronx to Sephardic Jewish parents, meaning Jews of Spanish origin. Both of her parents were born in Turkey, though her father, Nessim Hasdai Gormetzano, grew up in Sicily. When Nessim Gormetzano emigrated to the United States, he changed his surname to Gourmet. Steve and Edie, Mr. Leibowitz and Ms. Gormetzano, married in 1957. But there was a problem, one they described in an interview given to the New York Times in 1992. Quote, "The major problem was his mother," Ms. Gourmet explained. "She said she'd put her head in the oven if Steve married me." He rolled his eyes and tried to get a word in edgewise, but she plunged on. "To the day his mother died, she said I wasn't Jewish, but Spanish," unquote. Yes, my friends, that sounds like a Brooklyn-born Ashkenazic Jewish woman of my grandmother's generation. Writing in the New York Times, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Robert D. McFadden put Steve and Edie's career together in perspective. Quote, "Billed as Steve and Edie in Carnegie Hall concerts, on television, and at glitzy hotels in Las Vegas, the remarkably durable couple remained steadfast to their pop style as rock and roll took America by storm in the 1950s and 60s. Long after the millennium, they were still rendering songs like Our Love Is Here to Stay, Just in Time, and One for My Baby and One More for the Road, for audiences that seemed to grow old with them. What's in a name? And the ulterior motive behind this post. I will admit that I've always been fascinated by this name change thing. It seems to me that there are two reasons for someone in the American entertainment industry to change their names. The first is to create a memorable image that their given name does not. I mean, do any of us really believe that Rock Hudson was a real name? Well, of course not. Dude's given name was Roy Harold Scherer, Jr., 1925 to 1985, a name that most certainly does not roll off the tongue. So Roy became Rock, just like Margaret, Mary, Emily, and Hira became Meg Ryan. Mark Sinclair became Vin Diesel. Eric Marlon Bishop became Jamie Foxx. Karen Elaine Johnson became Whoopi Goldberg, and so forth. But the other reason behind such a name change, particularly during the first half of the 20th century, was, from a social point of view, far more compelling. And that was to blend in by denying one's ethnicity and even religion. In their ongoing effort to assimilate with the white Anglo-Protestant American majority, it's amazing the lengths that not just Jews, but Italians, Poles, Hispanics, and Slavs went to in order to mask their ethnic identities during the first half of the 20th century. Nowhere was this more prevalent than with Jewish entertainers. Just so, Danilovich Dembski became Kirk Douglas. Julius Garfinkel became John Garfield. Daniel Kaminsky became Danny Kaye. Alan Koenigsberg became Woody Allen. Gene Silverstein became Gene Wilder. Shirley Shrift became Shelley Winters. Leova Rosenthal became Lee Grant. And Semille Friesen became Diane Cannon. Do you want some more? Okay, here's a few more. Marion Levy became Paulette Goddard. Michael Orowitz became Michael Landon. Jill Oppenheim became Jill St. John. Benjamin Kubelski became Jack Benny. Leonard Schneider became Lenny Bruce. Ira Grossel became Jeff Chandler. Muni Wiesenfreund became Paul Muni. Melvin Kaminsky became Mel Brooks. Nathan Birnbaum became George Burns. And Leonard Hacker became Buddy Hackett. In the world of 20th century American music, both concert music and popular music, the list of Jews like Sidney Leibowitz, Steve Lawrence, who changed their names in order not to sound like Jews, is, well, a really long list. For example, Ellen Cohen became Cass Elliot. Belle Silverman became Beverly Sills. Janice Fink became Janice Ian. Carol Klein became Carol King. Alvin Morris became Tony Martin. Jakob Perlmuth became Jan Pierce. Roberta Peterman became Roberta Peters. Itzhak Balin became Irving Berlin. Jacob Gershowitz became George Gershwin, and Seymour Kaufman became Cy Coleman. And, as I trust we all know, Robert Zimmerman became Bob Dylan. What these and 1,000+ other staged names tell us is that there was a time, not so very long ago, when it was necessary for certain people of certain ethnicities to hide who they were in order to function in an American professional milieu. Steve Lawrence, today's birthday boy, is just such a person. Speaking for myself, I can only hope that were Mr. Lawrence born a generation later, he would wear his birth name of Sidney Leibowitz with appropriate pride. Although, maybe not. Thank you. To sample and download one or all of my many courses on subjects musical produced by the Great Courses / The Teaching Company, please visit my website at robertgreenbergmusic.com.